History of England, Revised Edition, 1938, by W. E. Lunt, Professor of History in Haverford College. Harper and Brothers, New York, London. To my wife, Elizabeth Atkinson Lunt. Editorial Foreword. The passing years in no sense diminish, they rather increase the appreciation of the importance of English history. Nowhere is that more evident than in the United States. We long since ceased to be a part of Great Britain's empire overseas, but so long as our institutions, language, and culture remain in any degree what they are today, we shall seek their origins in England, and in doing it pay tribute to a British empire more enduring than the visible evidences of its power and dominion. One evidence of this growing appreciation of the importance of English history and civilization, in which our own takes root, is the several books on English history, each with its own excellencies, which have appeared recently. When author, editor, and publisher combine to add another to the list, they may properly be asked to offer a word of explanation of just what has been done and why. Frankly, this book does not seek to be all things to all students from the junior high school to the graduate student. It is primarily a college textbook for the general course in English history. It is therefore free to give a treatment suitable to the importance of the topics included. Even more important is the maintenance of a sense of selection and proportion by which alone a history of England can be kept from an Even more important is the maintenance of a sense of selection and proportion by which alone a history of England can be kept from an unmanageable overload of names and political details. England has played an important role in many ways and through a long period. The eagerness to know your own day through contemporary history is more likely in English history than in any field to obscure the fact that to know today we must know the yesterdays. But that less familiar past in which the present of both England and America finds its roots requires its just attribution of emphasis and proper space for its interpretation. It seems to me that in this matter, Professor Lunt has most sturdily and successfully maintained or perhaps restored a balance in the treatment of past and present, medieval and modern. England's political history, treated usually in chronological sequence, has furnished in this volume the thread so necessary for the guidance of the student. It enables him to follow in orderly fashion the author's treatment of English social, economic, constitutional, religious, and intellectual developments. It was not Professor Lunt's purpose to write a history of the British Empire, but empirical policies and interests are dealt with where they have notably affected the history of England. The whole organization and treatment is easily followed and can be reviewed by the use of topic side headings which do not interrupt the thread of the narrative. The scholarship and teaching experience of the author are represented in the text. The bibliographies have been added not as evidences of erudition, but as aids to the student and teacher who would pursue further for himself any of the many topics that arouse his particular interest. After reviewing this volume in both manuscript and printed form, I can say that so far as editorial complicity in producing another English history is concerned, I feel quite cheerful and conscience-free and quite ready to see the appraisal I have expressed in this foreword put to the test which comes by use. Guy Stanton Ford, March 1928. Acknowledgements. I regret that the detailed notation of the sources of my information would so increase the length and complexity of the book as to defeat one of its principal purposes. For quotations and conscious paraphrases of the words of another, I have attempted to give references. Since my reading on the subject has extended over a period of many years, I have failed through inadvertence to acknowledge some such direct borrowings. If that proves to be the case, I ask indulgence. To the host of other authors from whose researches my knowledge has been largely derived, I take this opportunity to express my thanks and my appreciation for their scholarly guidance. In establishing the proportion and perspective which are of such fundamental importance in the present type of treatment, I have been aided by a factor of such a character that it admits of no precise definition. Lectures delivered by Professor Alfred L. P. Dennis, Professor Roger B. Merriman, President A. Lawrence Lowell, Professor Edwin F. Gay, Professor Charles H. Haskins, and the late Professor Charles Gross, to which I listened with enjoyment as a student, have influenced profoundly the development of my views with regard to the significance of many aspects of English history. Though I have not intentionally adopted their views or borrowed their ideas directly, it is possible that even the turn of a phrase has lingered unconsciously in my thoughts to find expression in the following pages. If any of the interest with which they endowed the subject has found its way into my narrative, my indebtedness to them is indeed great. To those who assisted in the preparation of the book, I am deeply grateful. Portions of the manuscript, which fall within the respective fields of their expert knowledge, were read by Dr. Isaiah Bowman, Director of the American Geographical Society, Dr. G. M. Wrigley, Editor of the American Geographical Review, Professor Roland B. Dixon of Harvard, Professor E. A. Hooton of Harvard, Professor William A. Morris of the University of California, Professor Albert B. White of the University of Minnesota, Professor Howard L. Gray of Bryn Mawr, Professor Roger B. Merriman of Harvard, Professor Wallace Notestein of Cornell University, Professor Avery O. Craven of the University of Illinois, Professor Bernadotte Schmidt of the University of Chicago, and Professor Herbert C. Bell of Wesleyan University. The editor of the series, Dean Guy Stanton Ford, gave to the whole manuscript the benefit of his ripe scholarship. The constructive and stimulating criticisms of these generous scholars helped me to discover errors of fact and judgment, and to improve the narrative in many other ways. In the final stages of preparation, the publishers have rendered valued assistance. To my wife, I am happily indebted for much criticism and aid. For the errors and shortcomings which remain, the responsibility is mine. W. E. L. Haverford, Pennsylvania, March 6, 1928. Further acknowledgments. The changes incorporated in the second edition rest largely upon the suggestions made by teachers and students who have used the book in its earlier form. It is a pleasure to extend to these friendly and constructive critics my sincere thanks for their generous assistance. I wish also to acknowledge my indebtedness to several of my colleagues at Haverford for advice on certain problems which fell within their respective fields of knowledge. W. E. Lunt, Chapt, Maine, June 29, 1937. History of England. Chapter 1. the land and its early inhabitants. The development of civilization by the inhabitants of England has been affected profoundly by the location of the British Isles on the globe. Physically and culturally, they form part of the continent of Europe. Centuries before written history begins, they were attached to the continent by land. The earliest men who lived in Britain may have walked from the site of Calais to that of Dover Dryshot. The creation of the seas around the British Isles in prehistoric times rendered communication more difficult, but left it comparatively easy. The Strait of Dover is only 21 miles wide, at its narrowest part. For many centuries, peoples migrated from the continent to the islands, bringing with them new civilizations. Each new group kept more or less in touch with the people of the mainland. Every great intellectual, religious, economic, or social development which occurred in Western Europe affected England sooner or later. English civilization, consequently, has been a European civilization, and England, from the earliest times, has taken a part in European affairs. The separation of the water has been enough, nevertheless, to produce in Britain a certain independence in the development of her civilization. Before the days of steam navigation, communication across Britain's water frontier was not as easy as communication across most of the land frontiers surrounding the peoples of the continent. The fundamental ideas, moral, political, social, commercial, or whatnot, which from time to time have been carried from one portion of Europe to another to influence deeply the modes of life followed by the peoples of Western Europe, have generally come to Britain late. They have also come more slowly, given more time for assimilation and more opportunity for independent development. The Reformation, for example, took a course in England different from that taken anywhere on the continent. The Teutonic dialects carried to England by the Anglo-Saxons grew into English, which differs from modern German. The Christianity established in Britain by the Romans developed an ecclesiastical organization unlike the established generally in Western Europe. To say that the isolation of Britain was the sole cause of any of these developments used as illustrations or of the multitude that might be cited would be an exaggeration, but the isolation was, without doubt, an important contributory cause. The independent views of the average Englishman, his conservatism, his love of precedent, what in short is often termed his insularity of mind, may be attributed in large degree to his insular environment. A contemporary man well question whether the rapidity of communication which has developed within the past century is not breaking down before his eyes the isolation productive of this independence of thought. But there can be no question of its existence under the conditions which surrounded human life in the past. The water barrier has also protected the islands from attack. It has not been a complete protection. In the early period of England's history, several peoples crossed the water and obtained a foothold for the successful conquest of the land. Yet it has made invasion difficult. Since the 11th century, Britain has never suffered any significant armed invasion from an external foe coming across the water except 2 occasions when large groups of Englishmen assisted the invaders. The necessity of transport by water, moreover, has forced the invaders who have conquered the islands to advance their occupation slowly, resulting generally in the assimilation of the invaders by the invaded, or in an adjustment between the two. The security provided by the saltwater girdle has helped to give to English history a continuity of development unrivaled by that of any area of equal size on the continent. Since the 5th century, there have been no sharp breaks in English history. The location of Britain in relation to the world as a whole was once very different from what it is now. Before the discoveries of Columbus and Vasco da Gama, Britain was at the outside edge of the known world. Europe, Northern Africa, and Asia constituted the realm of the known, and the knowledge of the far parts of these areas was slight. In ancient and medieval times, the Mediterranean was the center of civilization and of commerce. Oriental products were brought by caravan to the shores of that sea, whence the Mediterranean peoples distributed them throughout Europe. England was in touch with this current of world trade from prehistoric times, but it was too remote from the center of exchange to have an influential part. Its position was similar with regard to civilization, which went hand in hand with commerce. Civilization radiated from the shores of the Mediterranean. Civilization radiated from the shores of the Mediterranean. The farther from the center a people was located, the more backward was its culture. Until modern times, England, in the utmost corner of the West, was slow in the development of its civilization. With the vast expansion of the known world, which took place in the 15th and 16th centuries, Britain's situation was reversed. The ocean on its western flank ceased to be a barrier. Gradually, as exploration, exploitation, and colonization of the newly discovered lands progressed, the ocean became the principal pathway of communication. The Atlantic superseded the Mediterranean as the center of commercial activity. England ceased to be at the end of the world and almost literally became the center. It was thus favorably located to become the transit point of a large share of the new commerce which rapidly came into being. The English took full advantage of the opportunity. Ocean exploration, colonization, and development of a seaborne trade supplemented one another, until today a political map of the globe displays England as the heart of the greatest empire in the world, while the red lines of a commercial map converge upon England in a way that demonstrates conclusively her dominant position as an entrepot. The exchange of a marginal for a central position has been a vital moment in England's history. The salient characteristics of the surface of Great Britain became apparent if a line slightly convex toward the east is drawn from the mouth of the Exe in Devonshire to the mouth of the Tees in Yorkshire. To the north and west of this Exe-Tees line are the Highlands, and to the south and east the lowlands. The mountains and hills of the north and west are not generally very high, few peaks exceeding a height of 3,000 feet, but they cover most of the surface in this region. They are so distributed as to break the island into several well-defined physical sections. The highest mountains are the Highlands of Scotland. South of them were the Firths of Forth, and Clyde carry the coastline far inland. Is a narrow plain, where dwells the largest part of the population of Scotland. Between this plain and England is a broad mountainous band which runs approximately east and west from coast to coast. A narrow belt of coastal lowland around the eastern end and river valleys on the west provide natural routes of communication. They have not been sufficient or counteract entirely the tendency of the mountain barrier to separate the two portions of the island. To this day, Scotland retains an individuality of its own, and throughout most of the historic period, Scotland and England have been inhabited by peoples more or less alien to each other. From the Cheviots, the Pennine chain extends south into the center of the plain. In the Lake District, the Cumbrian Mountains carry the highlands out to the western coast, but for most of their course, From the Cheviots, the Pennine chain extends south into the center of the plain. In the Lake District, the Cumbrian Mountains carry the highlands out to the western coast, but for most of their course, the Pennines divide the lowlands of the east from the lowlands of the west. They are cut by the two narrow gaps of the Tyne and the Aire, which facilitate communication between east and west. To the west, the Cumbrian Mountains cover Wales, except for a narrow strip of coastal lowland. They are deeply scored by valleys, and the broken character of the surface impedes internal communication. The water parting, however, is far to the west. Short streams flow down to the western coast, while the longer rivers follow the eastern slope. The character of the surface tends to segregate the inhabitants of the district. For many centuries, they were practically independent of the peoples who controlled the plain. The difficulty of internal communication, however, made national unity difficult to attain. The eastward flowing streams enables the invaders to penetrate far into the interior. The several centuries by which the union of Wales with England preceded that of Scotland find a partial explanation in topography. South of the Cambrian Mountains are the heights of Cornwall and Devon in the extreme southwest of England. The continuity of the uplands in the western part of the island is broken by the Chester Gap, a broad belt of lowland which penetrates to the western coast between the Pennines and northern Wales, and by this Severn Gap between southern Wales and the heights to the south. When the peoples of the hills and the plain have been hostile, as has often been the case, these gaps have been of advantage to the latter. They have also served to give the people of the plain direct access to the ocean, which has been of great value for purposes of communication, especially in modern times. The plain to the south and east of the Xtes line occupies the major portion of England. It is crossed by several ridges or uplands, running from the southwest towards the northeast or east. Let's read that again. The plain to the south and east of the Xtes line occupies the major portion of England. It is crossed by several ridges or uplands running from the southwest toward the northeast or east. They include the Cotswolds, the Chilterns, and the north and south Downs. The tops of these rarely rise to 1,000 feet above the level of the sea, and most of the surface is below the contour line of 500 feet. The ridges give to most of the plain the character of rolling country. The plain is the most fertile and most habitable portion of the islands. Its location in the southeast places it in the path of invaders from the continent. It is the easiest for invaders to approach and the most desirable to hold. Consequently, newcomers from across the seas more than once have driven the natives of the plain to seek protection in the more inaccessible highlands of the west and north. Wales and Scotland were long inhabited by peoples of speech different from that of those who lived on the plain. The antipathy thus began was fostered by the terrain, and it survived to color many centuries of British history. The Xtes line also divides the country geologically. North and west are the harder rocks of the older formations. South and east are the softer rocks of more recent formations. In the region of the harder rocks, the soil is generally scanty and infertile. Such soil as can be used is given mainly to pasture. Large portions of the highlands of Scotland and parts of the interior of Wales are barren moorlands, which are waste or at best poor pasture. Cultivated land in this section is confined mainly to the valleys and to the small areas of plain. In Scotland, 12% of the land is now under cultivation and 8% is in permanent pasture. In Wales, the corresponding figures are 15 and 43%. But in England, where the land is mostly plain of the more recent geological formations, 32% of the land is arable and 42% is in permanent pasture. During the many centuries when the pursuits of the people of Britain were predominantly rural, the north and west were more sparsely inhabited than the south and east. Footnote: the historical changes in the density of population are well illustrated by maps in A.P. Usher's Introduction to the Industrial History of England, pages 95 to 99. End of footnote. For large parts of the two areas, this proportion still holds good, but the growth of industry since the Industrial Revolution began in the 18th century has concentrated population near the fields of coal and iron, which lie north of the XT's line. Outside of the metropolitan area of London, the most densely populated districts today are found in the south of Wales, in the lowlands east and west of the Pennines, and in the lowlands of Scotland. One aspect of the surface which had great influence upon the early history of Britain no longer exists. Today, only 5% of the land is wooded. In later prehistoric times, primeval forests were so nearly universal that the chalk downs and moorlands, because they were free from the thick growth, became the principal centers of human habitation and the main trackways of communication. Even in the time of Celt and Saxon, Dane and Norman, parts of the land were so heavily wooded as to impede communication, break up portions of the plain into isolated sections, and hinder the progress of national unity. Marsh and fen, which have now disappeared before the hand of man, also helped to divide the country into separate units and to retard the progress of civilization. In the south, for example, the dense forest of the Weald obstructed pronunciation. Weald, would that be? W-E-A-L-D? In the south, for example, the dense forest of the Weald obstructed communication between the coast and the interior. The South Saxons, who conquered Sussex at the time of the Anglo-Saxon conquest, were so isolated from the rest of Britain by the forest and by Romney Marsh on the east that they were the last of the Anglo-Saxon peoples to receive Christianity, although the religion was first introduced into the neighbouring kingdom of Kent. In the east, a great marsh called the Fens occupied a large part of the county of Cambridge and adjoining districts, made that now fertile land a waste, and gave to East Anglia a seclusion which more than once becomes apparent in the history of the locality. Many other forests and marshes affected similar results in a lesser degree. Footnote. Green, Making of England, pages 7 to 12, and the maps. Passim. End of footnote. The coastline of the British Isles is exceptionally broken. The continent of Europe, which is well endowed with coast, has 1 mile of it for about every 200 square miles of surface. Great Britain has 1 mile of coast for every 20 square miles of surface. The many indentations in the coast provide harbors which facilitate communication with the outside world. The harbors, moreover, are readily accessible to the power of the interior, for numerous rivers flow down to the sea, and no place in Great Britain is more than 70 miles from the coast. In the era of small boats, almost any depression in the coast was a possible landing place, although the mouths of streams were generally favoured, since their valleys offered routes into the interior. The larger ships of modern times need deeper water in harbours protected from storms. These are provided plentifully by the many rivers which receive tidal waters. Though the western coast of Great Britain has a more indented outline than the eastern, it has fewer important ports because the mountains offer a barrier to communication with the interior, and the streams flowing into the sea on the side of the island are generally short and steep. The most significant aspect of the English river system is the location of the main water parting. Since this is in the west, the rivers flow comparatively long distances through the plain to the east. The gradients are easy, the waters flow gently, and hence they are navigable for small boats for long distances. That is, navigable. During the many centuries of poor roads, When goods had to be carried overland, many on pack animals, the existence of these numerous waterways was of the highest importance for the facilitation of transportation. Even in these days of good roads and railways, carriage by water has the advantage of cheapness. In the early dawn of English history, the rivers supplied the only available routes of transportation to many places in England, and the easiest ways of communication. The rivers, moreover, offered early invaders available routes into the interior, and often the most desirable places for settlement. The rivers provided water, a vital necessity, and the alluvial soil of their valleys is fertile and well watered. A glance at the map of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms demonstrates that in more than one instance, river basins determined the course and settled the limits of the political expansion of the group of the Teutonic invaders. Footnote. A map which illustrates this particularly well is given by Leeds in his Archaeology of the Anglo-Saxon Settlements, page 19, end of footnote. The rivers of Britain have been important agents in the development of British civilization. In their climate, the British Isles are particularly fortunate. They are located between 50 degrees and 60 degrees north of the equator, where they receive from the sun the same amount of heat as Labrador or central Russia. Their climate, however, is much milder than that common in this latitude. They never suffer such snow and cold as defeated Napoleon's campaign to Moscow, nor are their ports ever icebound as are those of Labrador. Their climate is profoundly modified by their location in the ocean and in relation to prevailing winds and currents. The ocean in the winter is warmer than the land, and in summer it is cooler, because the land radiates heat more rapidly than water. The prevailing winds over the British archipelago are from the west or southwest, and in the winter they come from warmer latitudes as well as over the warmer ocean. They also cause a northeasterly drift of the surface of the North Atlantic, which brings warmer water to the shores of Great Britain. These factors so modify the temperature due to the direct rays of the sun that Great Britain is warmer in winter and cooler in summer than inland districts located in the same latitude. Around London, where the greatest variation between the temperatures of winter and summer occurs, the average temperature during January is 39 degrees Fahrenheit, and during July, 63 degrees. In Moscow, the averages are 13 degrees and 67. In the British Isles, snow seldom lies on the ground for more than a few days. In the summer extreme, heat such as occurs even in the northern part of the United States is almost unknown. Refrigerators are not commonly found among the households effects of English families. The British Isles enjoy a remarkably equable climate. Because of the location of the highlands in relation to the moist winds from the ocean, the rainfall is abundant. It is well distributed throughout the year and hence is of the greater value for the production of vegetation. With natural resources, the British Isles are well supplied. The soil and the climate are favorable for a production of victuals and drink, the most fundamental of man's material needs. Some plants grown in the northern part of the United States cannot be raised in England, but of the common cereals and grasses which constitute the basis of human sustenance, corn, i.e., maize, is the only one of importance which will not mature in England. Pasture grass is the most common crop of Great Britain. The plentiful moistures makes it of exceptionally good quality, and the equitable climate renders its growth possible all the year round in the western part of the islands. Since it grows best in the wetter regions, the west and north are pastoral. Oats may be grown in nearly all parts of the island where the soil is suitable. Wheat can be ripened regularly only in the warmer and drier eastern counties. The east and the southeast of England, where the soil as well as the climate is most fit, are the agricultural sections of chief importance. Early peoples, whose principal pursuits were pastoral or agricultural, found the islands well adapted to their needs. Their crops, their cattle, and their swine constituted their principal wealth. In the Middle Ages, sheep growing also became a leading industry. Fishing has been pursued from the earliest times, and the rich supply of fish located in the shoals of the North Sea has made it a staple industry. In the early and Middle Ages, these were the natural resources of chief value to the inhabitants, and they are still of fundamental importance in the economic life of the islands. The mineral wealth of the islands was utilized only in small part before 1800. Our first written evidence concerning Britain relates to the tin mines of Cornwall, and until the 19th century, they remain the chief source of the world's supply. Copper, lead, and iron have been mined since before Roman times. The deposits of lead and iron are still extensive, although the copper has been nearly exhausted. Only traces of the precious metals have been found. Coal, the most important of England's mineral resources today, was but little used before the 17th century. Charcoal produced from wood was employed for smelting, and wood and peat were employed for fuel. Granite, sandstone, limestone, and slate, which are used in place of wood for building purposes, abound in many parts of the islands. In the southeast of England, bricks are the common building material. Elsewhere, there are deposits of clay suitable for potteries. In the natural resources, the different parts of the islands do not share equally. England has the largest amount of good agricultural land and the richest supplies of iron and coal. The highlands of Scotland are in large part too barren even for pasture, and they are exceptionally poor in mineral deposits. Ireland lacks sufficient coal to promote its industrial development. This disproportion in the distribution of natural resources holds good with regard to many other geographic factors. England has the largest share of the plain, of the rivers, and of the good harbors. It is located in the most advantageous place for intercourse with the continent, and its surface is sufficiently diversified to supply a greater variety of human wants than that of any of the other divisions, but not so broken by mountains as to oppose the obstacles to political and social unity found in Scotland and in Wales. Thus England, the largest of the natural divisions of the islands, is designated geographically for the position of leadership it has always held historically. Our knowledge of the men who were the earliest inhabitants of Britain is derived from material remains, which have to be interpreted for us by the archaeologist, the anthropologist, and the geologist. Written evidence is so preeminently the material from which the historian works that the period of the people's history antecedent to the appearance of written records is commonly called prehistoric. In Britain, written evidence becomes common only with the coming of the Romans. The story of human activities in Britain before 55 BC rests upon inferences drawn from the implements, dwellings, fortifications, burial mounds, and bones which have survived the intervening centuries. Footnote. Britain is mentioned briefly by a few Greek writers before 55 BC. End of footnote. Since this evidence supplies no dates, the successive developments of civilization in the prehistoric period are classified by types of culture. The peoples of Britain, along with those of Western Europe, generally pass successfully through three principal stages. Distinguished by the past... let's read that again. The peoples of Britain, along with those of Western Europe, generally pass successfully... One more time. The peoples of Britain, along with those of Western Europe, generally pass successively through three principal stages, distinguished by the character of the tools and weapons which they used. In order of succession, they were the stages of stone, bronze, and early iron. The stage of stone lasted so much longer than the other two that subdivisions have been found convenient. In Britain, these are the Aeolithic, dawn of stone, the Paleolithic, Old Stone, Mesolithic, Transitional, and Neolithic, New Stone stages. The temporal length of these stages can be estimated only by the roughest of approximations. When an archaeologist discovers in the earth stone tools which were made by man, he can assign them to one of these stages by their types. If they are found in a recognizable stratum of the earth's surface, the geologist can give them an approximate date. Geologists have determined the order in which the strata of the earth's surface were formed and the approximate length of time which the deposit of each layer consumed. The evidence which is used to estimate the time is far from exact, and as a consequence, scholars differ with regard to the probable length of the several periods. Footnote. Compare, for example, the timetables given by Osborne, Men of the Old Stone Age, pages 18 to 23, 280 as well. Osborne, Man Rises to Parnassus, pages 24 and 25. Voliami, Our Prehistoric Forerunners, page 15. Burkitt, The Old Stone Age, page 138. End of footnote. Implements of the Eolithic stage have been found in a stratum which belongs to the period classified by geologists as the Pliocene epoch of the Tertiary would be the pronunciation of that word. So let's try that again. Implements of the Eolithic stage have been found in a stratum which belongs to the period classified by geologists as the Pliocene epoch of the Tertiary era, and a reasonably conservative estimate gives to these objects an age of 500,000 years. The Paleolithic stage began during the Pleistocene epoch of the Quaternary era, which is known also as the Age of Ice. During this epoch, the glacial ice advanced and retreated in northern Europe several times, causing changes of climate from warm to cold, and leaving new deposits of soil after each advance. Paleolithic tools are often found associated with the remains of fauna and flora, which indicate that the climate was warm or cold and make it possible to determine that the users of the tools lived in a glacial or interglacial period. Since it is generally assumed that there were 4 glaciations, it is not always possible to assign a culture with precision to a given glacial or interglacial period, and differences of opinion among scholars with regard to such ascriptions have resulted in chronological estimates of the beginning of the Paleolithic stage, which vary by tens of thousands and even by hundreds of thousands of years. It seems to be the present tendency to associate the earliest Paleolithic culture with the second interglacial period, which is often estimated to have been taking place 200,000 years ago. The date has won nothing like universal acceptance, but it is no longer as important as it was when it was thought to mark the time of the earliest implements formed by the hand of man. Recent discoveries seem to indicate that human civilization was developing with more or less continuity from the Eolithic to the Paleolithic stage. The Paleolithic culture was superseded by the Mesolithic after the close of the Pleistocene epoch, at a date which may perhaps be placed between 12,000 and 8,000 years ago. The advance to Neolithic culture was made in Britain in the neighborhood of 3000 BC, to bronze somewhat between 2000 and 1800 BC, and to iron probably between 600 and 400 BC. The existence of man in England in the Pliocene epoch is attested by the discovery of tools made by the rough chipping of flints. The flints are so crudely fashioned that for a long time since that for a long time many archaeologists believed them to have been shaped by processes of nature, but several of those found in recent years are now acknowledged by eminent and conservative prehistorians to have been the handiwork of man. The men who produced this Eolithic culture were hunters, who derived their food from the chase. In this, they did not differ from their successor until the end of the Mesolithic stage, but the nature of their implements indicates that their civilization was on a lower plane. They were not only intelligent enough to manufacture tools which increased the efficiency of their labor, but they apparently knew also how to build a fire, and thus make their lives more comfortable. Concerning the type of men who wrought these beginnings, nothing is known because no human skeletons have been found in authentic association with them. The meagerness of this information about man and his earliest works is disappointing, but it is of no small importance to have established as highly probable that man had already begun that conquest of material which is the essential and distinguishing characteristics of his species. Footnote. Voliami, Our Prehistoric Forerunners, page 43. End of footnote. In the early Pleistocene epoch, man gradually improved the quality of his tools and increased their variety until he reached the stage designated as Lower Paleolithic. Footnote. The Paleolithic culture, which endured for such an unimaginable length of time, underwent slow but steady development. Archaeologists distinguish 6 phases of this progress, which are named after the places where good archaeological examples of each type have been found. They are in order from earliest to latest: Chellean, Arculian, grouped above as Lower Paleolithic; Mousterian, Middle Paleolithic; Aurignacian; Solutrian; Magdalenian, Upper Paleolithic. End of footnote. The men of this stage enjoyed a mild and genial climate, which enabled them to live in the open. Their remains are now found principally in alluvial deposits, whence they are sometimes known as men of the river drift. Their tools were better than those of their predecessors. More expert chipping and fuller trimming of the flints gave them sharper edges. The methods of manufacture improved, moreover, during the thousands of years through which this culture endured. 2 skulls excavated in deposits of soil made by a river give some idea of the manner of man who developed this industry. One found at Piltdown in Sussex has a jaw similar in some aspects to that of an ape, but a forehead which is straight like that of a man. Footnote. The date of the skull is disputed. It was found with tools too rough to be assigned certainly to any culture, with bones of Pliocene fauna, which had been rolled by the action of water, and with unrolled bones of Pleistocene fauna. Since the human bones had been little rolled, they seem more likely to belong to the Pleistocene epoch. Burkitt, Old Stone Age, page 124. End of footnote. The other, which was discovered at Swanscombe in Kent, is said to be of the same general type as the Piltdown specimen, but it is more primitive in its development and consequently earlier. It was definitely associated with one of the later phases of the Lower Paleolithic culture. Toward the close of the interglacial epoch, the colder climate forced men to seek protection in rock shelters and in caves. There they lived during the next glaciation, developing the higher type of culture of the Middle Paleolithic. The cavemen certainly had fire. They had clothes made of skins. Their tools and weapons display an improved technique and a greater variety. The apparently formal burials of some of the human remains contemporary with this culture are the basis of an inference that the Middle Paleolithic men had a religion. They were still hunters, though. Reindeer and other animals of subarctic climate were now the objects of their pursuit. Radically, these men were the Neanderthal type, having a long head, a low and retreating forehead, heavy eye ridges, an undeveloped chin, and a massive body about 5 feet in height. Eventually, a superior type of culture, which may be called Upper Paleolithic, appeared. Men still lived principally in caves and obtained their food from the chase. They developed a much larger variety of tools and weapons, using bone as well as stone for their manufacture, and they gave their flints a beauty of form and a fineness of finish hitherto unapproached. Most remarkable of all, however, was their development of a graphic art. On horn and bone and on the walls of caves they drew, carved or painted realistically the animals which they saw about them. Few of these drawings have yet been found in Britain, but the evidence of the existence of the Upper Paleolithic culture there is ample. The transition to the Upper Paleolithic culture coincided with the appearance of man of a higher type. He was long-headed, with a high forehead, a broad face, a well-formed chin, and a stature generally tall. Man of this type, which is called Cro-Magnon, resembled modern man much more closely than did his Neanderthal predecessor. Footnote. On the continent, another long-headed race known as the Combi-Capel was associated with this culture, and traces of a Negroid race have been found. End of footnote. Though this race predominated in Britain during the Upper Paleolithic stage, some of the men who lived there belonged to a round-headed race. Footnote. Burkett, Our Early Ancestors, page 100. Clark, Mesolithic Age, pages 11 and 107. End of footnote. As the climate gradually became temperate in the post-glacial epoch, the Upper Paleolithic was superseded by the transitional stage of the Mesolithic. This culture was marked by a deterioration in some of its aspects. The day of bountiful big game had departed. The nature of the implements and the heaps of shells indicate that man eked out a barer existence on small game and fish. The men of this period spread over a wider area than their Paleolithic predecessors, who seem to have been confined to England and Wales. They lived both in caves and in the open. One type of home occupied by those who did not live in caves was the pit dwelling, which was built by digging a circular hole in the earth, throwing up the excavated earth around the hole, and covering the top with poles and branches or skins. In one instance, Mesolithic pit dwellings have been found in a group, but the discovery hardly warrants the assumption that communal life was common. This culture was developed partly by the descendants of the people who inhabited England in Upper Paleolithic times, and partly by two separate streams of immigrants who came from the east and south. The racial history of Britain in this period cannot be told definitely for lack of skeletal remains. Footnote. Clark, Mesolithic Age, page 107. End of footnote. But the newcomers, like the natives, appear to have been mainly of Cro-Magnon stock. 13. Burkett, Our Early Ancestors, page 20, 21, 38, and 39. End of footnote. The Neolithic culture seems to have been brought to Britain principally by a people who came along the Atlantic seaboard from the Iberian Peninsula. They had long heads, but their narrow faces contrasted strongly with the broad faces of the Cro-Magnons. They probably belong to the Mediterranean race, which appears to have preceded the Alpine and the Nordic races, everywhere in Western Europe. Footnote. The principal distinguishing marks of these three races are as follows. Race: Mediterranean. Head: long. Stature: medium. Eyes: dark. Hair: dark. Race: Alpine or Celtic. Head: round. Stature: medium. Eyes: dark. Hair: dark. Race: Nordic or Teutonic. Head: long. Stature: tall. Eyes: blue. Hair: light. A variant of the Alpine type, which is tall, dark, and has a round head of a peculiar shape, is called Dinaric or Armenoid. It is classified by some as a fourth race. End of footnote. The immigrants settled among the people who already inhabited Britain, and the intermixture of the two races had the result that the blood of Paleolithic man runs in the veins of modern English men. When the new culture was established in Britain, it marked a tremendous stride in the advancement of civilization. It was distinguished by four principal characteristics. Number 1. Implements of polished stone were common. Many implements of chipped flint continued in use, but Neolithic men could make far more finely finished tools than their predecessors, and they had more varieties. Number 2. Pottery was manufactured. Number 3. Animals, including horses, cattle, sheep, hogs, and goats, were domesticated. Neolithic men still relied upon the chase for a considerable part of their food, but they were no longer entirely dependent upon it. Number 4. Agriculture was invented. Though it was of the most primitive sort, it was the greatest contribution to European civilization made by Neolithic men. Neolithic men not only appeared in all parts of the British Isles, but they also inhabited the country more thickly than their predecessors. They generally lived on the low ridges of chalk and limestone, which supplied water, were bare of the overgrown forests which choked the lowlands, and supplied good grazing grounds. They usually occupied huts of the pit-dwelling type, and they often grouped their huts in hamlets or small villages. Neolithic men constructed a few of the numerous prehistoric fortifications of earth found in Britain. They also built several types of sepulchral chambers, the most distinctive of which are called long barrows because of their shape. These material indications of organization in groups necessitate the assumption of a complete transformation of economic and social life. Since Paleolithic times, a hunting population... Let's read that again. These material indications of organization in groups necessitate the assumption of a complete transformation of economic and social life. Since Paleolithic times, a hunting population must necessarily inhabit a country sparsely and live singly or in small isolated groups in order not to destroy its source of food. With Neolithic man, we arrive at the stage of community life. Since such works as the long barrows imply communal action, there must have been some political organization, however crude, and some customs to regulate the rights and duties of members of the community in relation to other members. In all probability, too, there was some trade. Implements have been discovered made of a kind of stone which is not to be found in the immediate locality. The men of this age also worked flint mines on a scale which implies commercial exchange of the product. One of them has a shaft 50 feet deep and lateral galleries. The trade routes were the rivers and the pathways along the unwooded ridges, such as the downs of southern England. Probably coastal navigation had also begun. The stage of bronze, which began around 2000 BC, was probably coincident with the appearance of new immigrants in England. The long barrows, typically of the Neolithic culture, were superseded by round barrows. In these, the majority of the skeletons belonged to a new race of men whose heads were round and whose height was generally above that of the resident population of Longheads. The men of the new race, who came from the vicinity of the Rhine to the eastern and southeastern shores of England, appear to have introduced the round barrows, a new style of pot called a beaker, and metal implements, because the new pottery is the most distinguishing mark of their culture found among their material remains. They are often designated as the beaker folk, but their chief contribution to the advancement of British civilization was their knowledge of the use of metal in the place of stone. Footnote: the invention of bronze does not appear to have been made indigenously in Britain. The earliest tools of bronze give evidence of derivation from across the Channel, where bronze was used long before its appearance in Britain. Some of the early bronze implements found in southwestern England may have come from the Iberian Peninsula as the result of commercial intercourse. End of footnote. They settled most thickly in the regions which had been favored by their predecessors. Some of the native Longheads probably retired to the north and west before the newcomers, but the two peoples appear commonly to have intermingled. The progress of civilization in the stage of bronze was comparatively rapid, because the new tools could take a sharper edge and were much more efficient than the old. Progress was made chiefly along the lines already laid down in the preceding stage. The habitations remained much the same in character. Some stone huts may be assigned to this stage, and the hamlets were sometimes surrounded by defensive earthworks. The peoples of this stage also erected the great circles of huge upright stones, connected with religious observance, of which the best known is Stonehenge, or Salisbury Plain. The new implements of bronze were at first patterned upon the Neolithic models. Eventually, new shapes were produced, which made the implements better adapted to their respective purposes, and new tools, such as wheeled vehicles, were devised. The use of bronze, which is copper mixed with 10% of tin, resulted in the utilization of the tin located in Cornwall, and of the copper in that locality and in South Wales, and in the establishment of mines and foundries. Before the end of the stage of bronze, Britain had begun to export tin to the continent. The presence of ornaments made of glass, gold, and amber, which came respectively from Mediterranean lands, Ireland, and the Baltic, testifies to an important trade. Pastoral pursuits were becoming more common, since the people of this day lived less upon the products of the chase and more upon the flesh of domesticated animals. Agriculture still remained primitive in the early part of the period. The inhabitants of a hamlet cultivated a plot of land for a few years until it was exhausted, when they moved to new lands. Before the close of the period, agricultural pursuits were followed not only more extensively, but also more intensively. In some portions of Britain, the technique of cultivation improved so greatly that the settlements became more permanent. The people of the Bronze stage also knew how to weave cloth, which they used for clothing. The accumulation of wealth, which might be expected to accompany these developments, is witnessed by the many discoveries of personal adornments. The most striking testimony of the amelioration of the conditions of human existence, however, is the longer average of age which had been attained by the people buried in the round barrows, as compared with those buried in the long barrows. Hand in hand with this economic advancement must have gone development of religious belief and improvement of political organization, but the evidence admits of nothing beyond pure speculation as to the actual course of these changes. The people whom the Romans found in possession of Britain were in the stage of early iron. Because they spoke the Celtic language, they are known as Celts. By whom and when the Celtic tongue was brought to Britain is an unsolved problem, because it has not yet become possible to correlate the philological and the archaeological. Because they spoke the Celtic language, they are known as Celts. By whom and when the Celtic tongue was brought to Britain is an unsolved problem, because it has not yet become possible to correlate the philological and archaeological evidence. A theory that the Beaker folk who initiated the Bronze Age spoke Celtic is difficult to reconcile with the distribution of the archaeological remains. Another theory, that slashing swords and socketed axes, which appeared in England in the neighborhood of 1000 BC, were brought by Celtic invaders, meets no serious obstacle in the archaeological evidence. For that reason, it receives wider acceptance from scholars, but it does not yet appear to rest upon a very firm evidential foundation. Later in the Bronze Age, at least 2 invasions from the continent took place. And the second group of invaders, who probably came from the Rhine basin and Central Europe to southeastern England, in the course of 6th and 5th centuries BC, introduced iron tools and almost certainly spoke Celtic. During the stage of iron, still other peoples whose language was Celtic migrated to Britain. One group came from Western Gaul to southwestern Britain around 200 BC, and the Belgae, who were the last to arrive, began to cross from northern Gaul to the opposite shore only a few years before Caesar visited the island. However doubtful may be the origin of Celtic speech in Britain, it was the dominant language by the time of Caesar, if it was not the only one. The iron culture, introduced by the Celts, also prevailed, except in remote parts of the west and north. Yet the invaders did not supplant the older population. On the contrary, they mingled with the natives and added a long-headed Nordic strain to the racial intermixture which already existed. Footnote. Based upon the evidence of skeletal remains, which are still so few as to leave the situation somewhat obscure, the skeletons discovered in association with the early iron culture before Roman times are nearly all dolichocephalic, though some approach so near to brachycephalism that they give rise to the theory of racial intermixture among some of the invading Celtic peoples before they left the continent. At least one round skull, typically different from the skulls of the earlier Beaker folk, has been found in England, in connection with the remains of the early iron culture. The remains, on the other hand, leave no doubt that a large element of the long heads originally associated with the Neolithic culture survived the Celtic inroads. End of footnote. The new economic organization is called the stage of early iron to distinguish it from the Roman and later civilizations, for we still live in the stage of iron. The effect of the introduction of iron is to increase the efficiency of labor human. New types of tools appeared, and old tools, such as those used for agricultural purposes, were improved to so great an extent that man, with the same expenditure of energy, could make the soil yield larger crops. The same area could and did support a much larger population. Commerce increased, wealth accumulated, living conditions became more comfortable. In short, a higher type of civilization was developed. Agriculture and grazing continued to be the chief industries. Both were conducted on a much larger scale than formerly. Apparently, some of the valleys began to be cleared and settled in this epoch with the aid of the new iron tools. Survivals as well as allusions by classical authors indicate that pastoral pursuits predominated over agriculture. Iron and lead began to be mined and worked. The potter's wheel began to be employed for the production of more and improved pottery. The weaving of woolen and linen clothes becomes became common, and carpenters, coopers, leather workers, boat builders, and other artisans acquired a considerable degree of skill in their respective occupations. The natural result was a notable increase of internal and external commerce. Tin, which was sent across the Channel and to the Mediterranean, probably remained the staple export. A Roman, writing a few years before the Roman conquest, enumerated grain, cattle, skins, golds, silver, iron, slaves, and hunting dogs among the commodities brought to Italy from Britain. Their exports were thus raw materials. Their imports were principally luxuries, such as necklaces, bracelets, amber, and glassware. The most striking evidence of the economic development, however, was the introduction of money to facilitate the most striking evidence of the economic development, however, was the introduction of money to facilitate the exchange of commodities, which previously appears to have been accomplished by the direct barter of one commodity for another. The earliest money was in the form of bars of iron made in certain standard weights to represent different values. This currency was followed well before Roman times by stamped coins of gold and other metals patterned upon Greek coins. The increase in economic prosperity and a variety of results which can be traced still. Habitations remained much the same in their general type, although a few of the rich probably had houses containing several rooms. Household conveniences such as ovens, wooden drawers, and floors became common. I'm going to go back on that sentence. Habitations remained much the same in their general types, although a few of the rich probably had houses containing several rooms. Household conveniences, such as ovens, wooden doors, and floors, became common, and household utensils increased in number and in variety in the ordinary dwellings. Personal adornment occupied considerable attention. For clothing, bright-colored tartans were favored. Jewelry, as the list of imports indicates, was more popular than ever. The gentlemen of the period have left behind large numbers of the razors with which they shaved, and the ladies failed to remove all traces of the cosmetics which we are wont to associate with the toilets of the old ladies of the 19th century and of the young ladies of the 20th. With such ultra-refinements of civilization as these went, as we should expect association in larger communities. One complete village, lately unearthed, contained 80 dwellings, which, for those days, must have been a considerable town. Some of the communities, in fact, deserve the title of towns, since they were the commercial and political centers of considerable districts. The most notable concomitant of the greater prosperity was the development of a native art. This was not entirely indigenous. The Britons borrowed certain motives from across the Channel, but they developed them into a decorative art so distinctive that it is known as late Celtic or as early British. The largest unit of political organization was the tribe. It was ruled by a king or chieftain, who appears, in some instances at least, to have held his office by hereditary right. There was much intertribal warfare. Occasionally a strong king was able to subdue neighboring tribes and thus to extend his dominions, but this process of unification was always on a small scale. When the Roman conquest began, the land was divided among a large number of turbulent tribes. Their rivalries and their inability to combine for a common purpose aided the progress of Roman arms. The tribes were divided into smaller units called clans. The clan was a patriarchal group of relatives descended from a common ancestor. It was ruled, presumably, by the oldest competent male member. The basis of the political organization was thus a personal group, as usually is the case in a primitive society. The territorial unit generally develops only with a more highly organized type of government. Celtic society presents the great inequalities in social ranks often found in primitive societies. Besides the ordinary freemen, there were nobles and slaves. The class of slaves was doubtless drawn from the conquered population. About its rights or lack of rights, we have no certain information. Judging by later survivals, it seems probable that the slaves often lived in separate communities and paid tribute to the heads of the free clans, instead of working directly for the freemen. The aristocracy, if it was comparable to that of Gaul, was influential in the government of the tribe. About the social status and the political influence of the ordinary freemen, we know nothing. The Celts, like the Romans, had a number of gods. They were local, excepting a few more or less common to several tribes. Often they represented the personification of natural things such as wood, a stream, or a spring. The Celts worshipped in the natural temples provided by groves, and they made no images of their gods. They believed in a future life, the most characteristic aspect of their religious organization as their priesthood of Druids. Of the British Druids, Caesar gives no description, but he records a tradition that the institution originated in Britain, and he states that the Druids of Gaul often went to Britain to receive instruction in the higher branches of their cult. What Caesar says about the position of the Druids of Gaul may consequently be applied to the Druids of Britain without fear of great error. They presided at religious ceremonies which consisted mainly of divinations and sacrifices. Their practices, which sometimes extended to the immolation of human beings, appear to have impressed the Romans with their grimness and horror. They also preserved the religious doctrine, the traditions, and the lore of the tribe. In order to become a Druid, a long period of training was necessary. A principal part of the education was to commit to memory enormous quantities of sacred verse, which was preserved only in oral form. The Druids, who were the learned men of the day, gave such instruction as was available to the youths who sought an education. They also acted in a judicial capacity in such few cases as may be supposed to have come before public tribunals for decision. They appear to have been a queer combination of priests, magicians, medicine-men, teachers, and magistrates. They constituted a highly respected class with great influence in the community. When the Romans were conquering Britain, they found that the Druids were providing much of the inspiration behind the strong resistance of the natives. Thus the natives of Britain whom Caesar attacked were in a far more primitive stage of civilization than the Romans, but despite the assurance of Caesar that they painted their bodies for battle, they were far above the stage of civilization we are wont to associate with the savages. Yet the civilization was most unevenly distributed. In the remote parts of the West and the North, the civilization was still of the stages of bronze and stone. Iron implements, the basis of the economic prosperity on which rested the higher civilization of the South and East, had hardly penetrated to these parts in Caesar's day. Even in the portion south of the Xtites line, the culture was by no means uniform. Within this district, caves still supplied permanent homes occasionally, and the pit dwellings and thatched huts of wattle and dried mud were the most common abodes. The large number of fortifications maintained in the period demonstrates that warfare, the negation of all civilization, was still the order of the day, and the ladies and gentlemen of Glastonbury, who had wooden floors and doors, mirrors, and rouge, finally lost their heads when their well-fortified village was attacked by their foes.